Okay, it's recording. Oh wait, my name is Amanda. Okay. Okay, great. Everybody ready? Okay. Honorable Speaker, today the domination of global North languages is causing the endangerment and extinction of a large variety of the 7,000 languages that exist currently in today's world, and they are slowly decaying and dying, and so therefore we justifiably regret the rise of these global languages like English. 2 points under this. First point is that we think that this is inherently bad because these languages like English, like German, like Spanish and French are inherently colonial languages, right? We think that these countries came in, they came into these colonized countries and imposed their language, imposed their point of view, imposed their culture on these people, and now today in the status quo it acts in a sort of like neo-colonial type of stance where a person's success is often tied to their knowledge of these global languages like English, like Spanish, like French. And we think that it's often, and because quite often the positions that are high up, like in the government and things like that, often rely upon the knowledge of these global, quote, global languages. And we think that this is a very elitist position because that therefore makes these positions most accessible to the upper classes who can actually afford the type of education and be able to send their children to school to be able to learn English, to be able to increase their ability to like move up the social ladder. And we think that this type of ability isn't made available to especially to the lower classes or people who live in more rural areas who don't necessarily get the opportunity to learn these global languages and be able to make themselves better within society. And they're kind of stuck in this perpetual poverty because they don't know these global languages that are held by the highest positions within society, and therefore it's inherently inaccessible and unequal for these people. In addition, we think that this just continues the narrative that some languages are better than others, right, or more useful than others. And we think that this is inherently a bad thing, and I'll get into that in my second point about culture. We think that this just also goes. We also think that this is bad because in the status quo, linguistic change is often beholden to these former oppressors, right? They get to decide, like, this is the type of English that we want to have, and they often act in a very prescriptivist manner, right? That means, like, they say to you, we think that this is how you should speak, this is how English is properly spoken, like, your type of English, like this kind of mutilated English, isn't the correct form of English, and already you have this inherently unequal stance where you have both people are speaking English, right, but the one that is speaking, like, a more, quote, broken English or mutilated English is the one that's, like, inherently, like, is, like, considered lower than the person who's speaking this, quote, unquote idea of perfected English, right? And so we think that inherently you already get this sort of like unequal idea coming right out of the bat. So we think that rather than being prescriptivist in that way, we really need to be descriptivist and accepting languages as they are and encouraging the cultivation and the preservation of all of these other languages that are losing out to the global languages. We think that another impact of this is that it's forcing these people to work in the system of oppression that formerly oppressed them, right? We think that this causes them to capitulate into that system. It causes them to, like, acknowledge that these former oppressors still have a hold of them, right? Like, the English are, like, you know, like, Spain may not be the colonial power in South America anymore, but they still speak Spanish, and, like, it acknowledges that part of the oppression, and they continue to capitulate into that system that the Spanish set up, and now, because they now are forced to use the language of their oppressors in order to be able to better themselves in society, a society that is run by their oppressors. So it just continues that narrative that they have to work within this system of their oppressors. Moving on to my second point, which we think is also incredibly important, is that these languages are all inherently tied to, okay, sure, before I go to my
When you
next
say
point.
that there's a difference between a language like English spreading to many different countries now and people speaking it now rather than a language like Spanish in South America that's been there for hundreds of years?
No, actually, I'm going to argue that that's also inherently bad right in this point right here. Okay, so language is inherently tied to culture, right? We think that each like that a language is an incredibly important part of a culture and what makes up a culture, right? We think that different cultural perspectives shape a language and shape a person's point of view and the way that they interact with different people and the way that they look at the world, right? We can see this in the fact that there are words that exist in some languages that don't exist in others. Like, for example, there's a word in German called Torschlusspanik, which basically translates literally to door shutting panic, and it's this word that encompasses this idea that time is running out to achieve your life goals and you feel really, really stressed. But, like, we don't have that kind of word in English, right? So we think that, like, it's like, and I understand that, like, German is, like, a global North language, but the point being that these different languages like, all languages have words that don't exist in other languages and different cultural concepts and ideas. So, like, that's incredibly important to preserve. In addition, we think that, like, another cultural perception example is that, like, there's an Aboriginal language in Australia where culturally they orient themselves north, east, west, and south, and they actually do not have words for, like, left and right. So it just goes to show that, like, cultural perspective really informs the way that a language is spoken and a way that a people communicate with themselves and with the world. And we think that it's really important to keep these different cultural perspectives because we totally reject the idea, and we think that the movement of English, like Justin's POI, into other areas of the world is actually homogenizing and it's destroying culture, and we think that it's inherently a bad thing. We see this when English seeps into music in other countries, right? We all of a sudden see these different people, like, making music where they're using more English words, right? And they're losing out on what could have been, like, their own cultural perspective as they pull in a cultural perspective from English-speaking countries, and it's impacting their music, their art, and their literature. And we think that it's incredibly important because these different languages have the potential to birth all of these different forms of art and literature and philosophy, all these different ways of viewing the world that could be lost if we continue to allow global Englishes like English to continue to permeate and penetrate into society. We think another impact of this is that we're going to have a tension between older and younger generations, right? As the older generation attempts to hold on to their language and preserve their culture, and the younger generation, and the younger generation, which starts to move away, we all of a sudden have this tension created within society where they're like, what do we do? Do we embrace this global language that's going to oppress us? Or do we try and preserve our own culture because it's incredibly important? And that is why we are so proud to propose.
No, absolutely not.
Oh, I stole your pen. Can I keep it?
Don't forget to say your name.
It's okay.
For the rest of the round.
I'm Thomas.
I'm T-Dog.
Hey, no jokes.
Stealing pens across the aisle.
All right, is everybody good? Honorable Chairman, I want to start with a few points of rebuttal, and then I'll move into our constructive case. So I just want to start off by saying you talk a lot about colonialism and neocolonialism and how somehow, like, languages caused all this suffering in the world, but that happens on both sides of the house. If you look at just the incentives for, like, globalization and colonialism, they still exist, whether or not everybody's speaking the same language or not. Because if you look at it, when did colonialism start? When everybody was speaking different languages. Like, it would still happen. The only reason people speak the same language now is because colonialism happened. But to say that just because if we all stop speaking the same language, that none of the effects of colonialism would just go away, that just doesn't make any sense. But on our side of the house, we give the people who have been disadvantaged by colonialism access to the wealthier world. So rather than continuing to subjugate them even more by preventing them from accessing the globalized economy, we allow them to access that and better themselves. And then, let's see. You're right, Peter. So then you say the languages shape the way that we look at the world, and how, like, there are some words that only exist in certain languages. But is that really more important than, like, the concrete benefits of access to the external world? Because if you can't access the global economy or a lot of education opportunities only happen in English, but you can orient yourself north, south instead of left, right. Like, is that really what's more important to you? That, like, you have this tiny bit of culture, but you lose out on so much opportunity? And then your other example about musicians using English and not their native language. It's not like their music is, like, the culture of the music is entirely defined by the language they use. So maybe it's not quite as original and authentic, but they also export their culture and show that culture to many more people in the world, because English is a very well-spoken language, or it's spoken by a lot of people. So by throwing a little English in there, you increase your audience. The musicians make more money. They export their ideas to more people. Also, it's not only colonial languages that are the global North languages. If you look at Chinese, Chinese is the most spoken language in the world, and they never had a huge colonial influence, and they haven't been like forcing everybody to speak Chinese. It's just, there's a lot of Chinese people who speak Chinese, and people want access to the Chinese market, so they also learn to speak Chinese. Now, moving on to our points. Again, globalization happens no matter what. Globalization and colonization happen no matter what. But on our side of the house, we want to better the opportunities for the people who have been underprivileged because of those global forces. So our first main point is that people are way more likely to be empathetic if they speak the same language. If an immigrant comes to America and speaks English, people are going to be much more likely to empathize with that person and not see them as like, oh, the foreigner who's invading our country and taking our culture. They'll be like, oh, this person, like, I can communicate with them. I see them as another person. I am much more likely to empathize with them, want to help them, and just overall, I would not be nearly as antagonistic to immigrants if they speak the languages. I, as in, not me, but someone who's inclined to xenophobia. And then also, language is often a barrier for the underprivileged. For instance, if you immigrate to a country and you do not speak the language, you're going to have a very hard time finding a job. You need to find a job with people who speak the same language, because how can you work if you can't communicate with the people around you? Another example of this is many colleges in the West, which are generally the top colleges in the world, require English proficiency in order to go to them. And you can say that that's bad, but realistically, like, that is the status quo. So if it's just better for people to learn how to speak those languages so they get access to that education, rather than try to go back 300 years and just stop colonization, which is not what this debate is about. I will take your question.
Thank you. These schools that you're referring to are often only accessible to, like, the upper classes and those with the money who can afford them. So you're still leaving behind the people who cannot afford these schools and, like, be able to speak English and be able to, like, have economic progress like you're trying to say they will.
But I would argue that that happens, again, on both sides of the house. But on our side of the house, we're removing a barrier. Because, yes, education is expensive and generally only accessible to the rich, but what we're trying to do is give the underprivileged more options to advance themselves and become and gain access to that education and those other privileges by removing one of the barriers. Sure, there are still other barriers for underprivileged people to gain higher education, but on our side of the house, we get rid of a main one that is language. Also, if you can speak English, you have access to a major language. You have access to so much online education. If you look at like, there's so many courses put out by Harvard and MIT about, like, all sorts of things from coding to history that you can learn with only internet access, which is, sure, it's still definitely a privilege, but a very accessible one for most of the people in the world. So if everybody speaks English, they just have much more access to this education, even if they can't afford or don't have the other privileges necessary to actually attend one of these institutions. And this is only possible on our side of the house because no one's going to take the time to translate their courses into the 6,000 languages in the world. Like, that is just an unreasonable burden on these professors who have no time as it is. And then also, having only a few languages is just much more efficient. If you look, there would be a lot less miscommunications between different countries who speak different languages, so you would have a lot less waste. between suppliers and consumers. And there would be a better transfer of ideas, because if you can bounce ideas off of people from different cultures, because as you were saying, those cultures have different ways of seeing the world. Even if they speak the same language, that is still true, and then they can bounce those ideas off of each other and come to a better idea and create new products, better the world for everybody. And for even in local governments within a country, if you live in a country with tons of different languages, it's very hard for you to speak for yourself if you don't speak the predominant language. Like, it's not only small countries versus rich countries, it's also if you're in a post-colonial country that has like 100 languages, it would be way more efficient and easier to govern if all of those people speak the language, and people would be more able to speak out for themselves and correct injustices. And for those reasons, I'm proud to vote for this.
Here, here.
Okay. I don't like looking myself in the camera. My name is Nate. Is everyone good? Good. I think the framing that Elo gives you about both sides of the house still having to deal with the legacy of colonialism is a pretty massive cop-out when you consider that Amanda has made it explicitly clear in his speech that the maintenance of languages with colonial grammar and based in colonial ways of understanding the world are part of how colonialism continues to perpetuate itself in the status quo today. Given this, it means they can't access the comparative where both sides of the house deal with colonialism, which means we are actually justified in getting into a mechanistic debate about the comparative efficacy of our decolonial project, given that I think if both sides of the house have a conscience, they are all in general support of a decolonial project. That's not what the house is about, and I think this is a bad faith reading of the comparative. Given that, I have three pieces of independent rebuttal. First, they say that this allows people to become more empathetic to others. I think this refuses to engage with the constructive point Amanda made, that even when people are given the ability to speak English and ranking them above the hierarchy of people who don't speak English, it still makes people who were born speaking the language as their first language, or are born in places where the language is natural. For example, English speakers born in Canada, the United States, the UK, are always going to have an inherent bias over those people because there's going to be prejudice against people either based on other reasons, for example, race or immigrant status, or simply as a result of the language they speak being broken or dialectically inaccurate, even if it conveys the same amount of conceptual information, even if it's just his functional communicator, if it doesn't adhere to a grammatical standard that is itself reflective of like aristocratic values from centuries and centuries ago that have simply perpetuated their way through to the status quo, then it means that people who speak English will just simply have a form of English that is deemed less palatable, and means that there is no real empathy being provided because there's plenty of other reasons to be unempathetic, and just locks these people into a place where, yeah, they might have more opportunities to get jobs or immigrate and become globally exploited for their labor, but they will day in, day out never have the ability to get these sort of respect, or these sort of respect that would be intrinsic, that you would not have to work for if you had simply been born into that culture. Yes?
Wouldn't you say that there's less bias, though, if an individual spoke broken English in a community with English rather than if they spoke no English at all?
Here.
Sure. I think that's answered back by the point Amanda has made about this fomenting classism in smaller nations, right? I think, fundamentally speaking, if both sides seek a decolonial project, if we can prove to you, as I think Amanda has, and I will continue to do in this speech, that limiting the languages one can use to fight decolonial, to engage in a decolonial project limits the grammar of decolonialism you could use, this argument they present to you about buying into the system doesn't make sense, because it may result in more short-term good results for these people, but it limits the ceiling of with regards to the impact their movement can actually hope to have. Secondly, they make this argument about integrating with online courses. I think the simple answer to this is that, again, you need to think in terms of long-term impacts. This simply locks in the assumption that, like, the Harvard and Oxford way of understanding the world and presenting courses to people is the proper mode of knowledge. And if you're not able to access that, what are you even doing trying to get an education, as opposed to decolonial projects that try to achieve the same standard of education in alternate languages? We don't have to have a Harvard or an Oxford in 6,000 languages, but we can at least have Harvards and Oxfords that exist outside of Western modes of thought. Thirdly, they make the argument about miscommunication existing. I think this is answered by the fact that, obviously, given that Amanda has proven to you that the conventions of languages like English limit the grammar with which you can express concepts, I think it's just abundantly clear that more ideas, and ideas that are more accurately representative of different multicultural perspectives, come from a multiplicity of languages. On our constructive points, although I think this is pretty interwoven already. On our constructive points, I think what's pretty abundantly clear here is that the mechanism we seek is not simply one where people are able to sort of insert themselves in a social strata in a part of the global economy that is slightly higher than people who don't know how to speak English, but lower than people who don't. When Amanda tells you that there's classism enforced in these nations, that there are people who are always going to be more privileged in these colonialized nations who are able to access English, that means that while those people may in the short term get better results, it simply locks in and entrenches the hierarchy and allows the ruling elites in all of those countries to be content with it, because at least they can speak English, at least they can have better results than their fellow countrymen. The problem with this is that it means that it necessarily limits the ambitions these governments have towards decolonial projects, which means that things like the English standard means that more rural groups, for example, who are never going to be able to access things like English, are always going to be left out of the discussion. Any sort of more revolutionary tactic is not germane to the ruling class, is not germane to their ability to access things like the global north, and therefore is written off as something that it fundamentally should be decried, right? They make I think the impact of this is pretty large scale, right? Because I think the impact we talk about is not just the legacy of colonialism or an abstract idea that your music may or may not have English language words on it. When Amanda uses that example, it's not just the terminal impact to what we're talking about, but rather points to a more broad problem with the problem of cultural erasure and normalizing white Western ways of knowing the world as problematic, which is that it limits everyone who does not adhere to those standards, even if they speak English but speak it the wrong way, even if they speak English but don't come from a language where English is the norm, don't have the right accent, don't speak the right dialect, or still doing everything right but just don't have the same respect as someone who happened to be born in Iowa, means that all of these people are always locked into a liminal space where they have the grammar for revolution taken from them, where they have the ability to express concepts of change taken from them, the ability of imagining a way of knowing and a linguistic mode of understanding the world that exists outside of the global north taken away from them, but simultaneously always find true entry into the system forbidden, always find that there will always be some other factor, their immigrant status, their skin color, holding them, their accent, holding them back from ever truly being integrated, resulting in a sort of I suppose, false global bourgeois, wherein they are able to have comparatively more privilege and feel as though they've won the sort of materialistic economic war over their countrymen, and therefore feel just content enough to continue to allow the immiseration of those people, to continue to allow them to never have to continue to allow the elites in those countries to never actually have to worry, right? What they talk about, all their short-term integration, even if you give it to them on a truth level, is simply a band-aid that covers up the ability for actual decolonial projects to take root, for actual reintegration of culture to take root, right? Because what you have, they are fundamentally seeing that your grammar is taken from you here, right? When you take, for example, the fact that English has different connotations for certain hierarchical words, for example, the connotations in English versus certain sub-Saharan African languages of words like government and state are very different. It means that it is never possible to truly verbalize in a term your oppressors understand outside of their own vernacular the disagreements that you have with the way the global ruling class operates, the disagreements that you have with the status quo, which cuts off the potential, one, for any future decolonial projects writ large, because it means that any project you engage with still has to adhere to the more general norms of things like speaking the right way and engaging in Western capitalist neoliberalism. And two, means that there is always a system of classism that is permanently entrenched in these countries because now they have an incentive to do things like learn English to try to get an advantage over their countrymen, as opposed to a smaller country where both the upper and lower classes were able to speak these languages and therefore had comparatively better access and had a unified interest in this decolonial project. Ultimately, even if you give any side government any of these benefits they talk about, our side of the house still wins because we have access to better long-term impacts. Also, saying Chinese is a global language is a very bad faith reading of the motion because most of the native Chinese speakers are Chinese. Proud to propose.
A lot of non-Chinese people speak Chinese, though.
Not as a first language. Thank you.
Okay. I'm Charlotte, by the way. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you, Amanda.
So we agree with opening government that power dynamics exist within the world, right? But we think that those power dynamics are going to exist regardless of whether or not there are universal languages. I'm going to start by talking about what we believe universal languages are, because this has become a point of contention within this debate, and then go through and do some rebuttal to Nate's arguments before doing some weighing and going deeper into the arguments that Tommy brought you. So first, what is a universal language or a global language? We think these are languages that people speak between many different countries, that are often used for business, that are used for international communication, and that are used for languages of education. We don't think that you can't count Chinese as a global language, given that it's the most spoken language in the world and is a common language of business, and also that the Chinese are now investing heavily in Africa, and people there are starting to learn Chinese in order to engage within the market on an equal level, the same way that people did the exact same things they're talking about with French and English and Spanish hundreds of years ago. We think Chinese is definitely considered an international language. But whether or not that's important doesn't matter, because what we're talking about on the comparative is their world, or is the world of the status quo, where there are languages that are spoken by people around the world in many different countries. It doesn't matter if it's their first language or their second language. It's a language that is spoken by people around the world. We believe the comparative with that is historic past, where there were many, many more languages spoken by regional groups who couldn't communicate with other groups, even within the same areas. It was very difficult to have any kind of communication, even at a societal level. So a good example of this would be looking at China, where they had thousands of local languages. People couldn't communicate. We think this is a huge problem because it makes it incredibly difficult to have any kind of efficient governmental system. It makes it very difficult to have any kind of communication system that goes beyond communicating via voice with the people who are directly closest to you, and we think that has huge implications for the way that systems work globally. That's what we're debating on our side of the house. So first, a little bit of rebuttal. So Nate tells us that there's still going to be bias on our side of the house because people could be speaking broken English or a broken version of that language. We say, sure, that's probably true, but we think it's going to be far less than if you can't speak the language at all. Why is that the case? First, because oftentimes in order to even gain access to a conversation or gain access to a place, you literally have to be able to speak the language. There are restrictions for being able to immigrate if you don't speak the language at all. But we also think that empathy is often developed when you're able to have a conversation with someone and hear their story face to face. And that can't happen if you don't speak the language and you're not able to communicate. We think a broken conversation is better than no conversation at all. We think that on any side, that's going to be an impact that falls on our side of the house. We're better able to facilitate global communication because people are able to speak the same language and understand each other. Then we talk about education. We think that access to education is a huge point in this debate because, yes, it's true that, it's good when people are able to communicate in languages that aren't forced upon them. But we think now people aren't being forced to speak these languages. They're choosing it because they're better able to access economic opportunity and better able to better themselves, right? We think that it's not fair to tell someone that they need to learn their native or indigenous language and that they need to take an economic sacrifice and stay in their community in order to do that, rather than taking on a job or gaining access to education that will help them live a more comfortable life. We think that that's what opening government is insinuating that people need to do. Instead, we think that it's better for people to have the option to learn global languages and then be able to access education. So that can be going to schools that they wouldn't be able to enter because there are often language restrictions. If you want to go to a school in the US, you literally have to speak English. You're not allowed to go. But also to access the myriad of education options that are available online. So this can be videos streamed by Harvard, but this can also be Khan Academy, or this can be the millions of free YouTube videos that are available online but that you can't access unless you speak a language that many of these YouTube videos are filmed in. And we think if you speak only a small regional language that only a couple thousand people in your immediate area speak, you're not going to be able to access the information that's stored on the internet and gain access to huge amounts of information. We think this is really harmful because it means you're not able to gain education, which means you can't learn to code, you can't participate in the global market. It's harder to get a job, especially in service industries, or gain access to the education you need in order to gain a position higher up. But it also means you're not able to advocate for yourself or for your community. And we think that's an incredibly important point that they didn't respond to, right? Because yes, even if they're right and it's a huge problem that these languages exist, they exist now, and we need to give people the opportunity to advocate and fix it. And we think that given that there's always going to be an economic incentive for like global powers to try to take advantage of other powers. That's how every country has gained like power within the world. It's better for people within those countries who are being exploited, if that's the case, to be able to advocate for themselves, which they can't do if they don't speak the language and they can't get access to resources through like the internet or books or other mechanism. Okay, so then they talk about entrenching the hierarchy that exists. We think the hierarchy is actually worse in their side of the house because fewer people are gaining access to learning these languages, right? Like when a language is a global language and access is very easy, like when public education is taught within that language, when people learn it in school, when like a majority of people within an area or within like a region within the world speak a language, then more people have access, which means it's less of a hierarchy on their side of the house. The richest of the rich are still going to learn English. They're still going to go to Oxford, or they're still going to try to go to U.S. schools. Now they are entrenching like the very elite rather than having a larger like middle class and more people. Sure.
Sure. Can you please engage with the fact that perverse incentives are created within the existence of global language? That means now in these colonialized countries there is a perverse incentive wherein the ruling class has actively wants to promote like lower level people not learning English and not getting these opportunities.
Okay, so I think that's just not what's happening, right? Like, a perverse incentive where the elite try to stop other people from learning English. No, like public education systems give language opportunities, but even if that is the case, like we would rather have there be a global language, in which case more people are learning it. So I don't know how that fits into the comparative. So let's do a little bit of weighing here. What opening government gives you is they give you that this might make people feel like they've won a fight, but they haven't really. That they're going to like lose connection with their languages and with their culture, and that could be really important. What we give you on opening opposition is opportunities for people to gain tangible skills, to gain education, to gain access to like being able to be refugees and move into other places, and also that we get efficiencies across governments and between countries. We think that those tangible benefits should be able to be accessed by people around the world, and you get that much easier when you have the ability of people to communicate across cultures and across countries. You cannot have that on their side of the house when people aren't able to communicate. Thank you, and proud to oppose.
I can do with them.
No, just do the extension speaker.
Yeah. Were you going to be the extension speaker?
No.
Because you can do without.
Do you have the speech written out? What you were going to be?
Yeah, I was going to be extension.
That's fine. And yeah, just be extension speaker. Okay, well, glad you got to prep, Clara.
I'm gonna go.
Great.
No, no, just you can start.
All right, adios.
Say your name.
Who are you? We don't know you. Bye.
Just trying to.
You know he's going to the bathroom, right? He's not.
I'm
I thought.
I have an exam at 7, so
Oh, got it. Okay, good luck.
Bye.
Trying to.
Ten swear day. Just double checking. He wasn't just trying to follow me to the bathroom.
Okay. I'm Tom. Hello, everyone. Anything else I need to say?
No.
Okay. Okay, so as government extension, I want to start out first by jumping right into the first of my two arguments, as government. So, first of all, a huge topic of this discussion has been access to global markets, access to government, and the inability for one to advocate oneself in the global environment. And all of these are based on the assumption that global languages reign supreme, which is true. This is where we are. But what we're arguing here is that the rise of global languages, we regret this because through the rise of global languages, it's created this system in which to advocate for oneself, to participate in global markets, to access the internet, one has to know the English language, for example, which is the language of business and the language of the internet for the most part. It's a language of computer science. It has the very, very widespread impacts. So this is it's an unhealthy system, and what we want to argue is that global languages create the system where you need to have the global language here. So healthy economies are not built from the top down. like in colonialism, where wealthy elite arrived, had power, were able to impose their power and build downwards. Well, healthy economies and healthy governments are built from the ground up, where people can communicate with each other in their comfortable languages. They can communicate with themselves, between each other, in complete comfort, and they're able to best express their ideas in their own language rather than in the foreign language. And by expressing in their own language, they're able to best preserve their culture, all these points that have been previously argued. So my second idea that I think is really essential to this argument is we talk so much about education, and we talk about access to the internet. We talk about access to Western culture and the culture of these colonial countries. And so what this is assuming, this argument is assuming that Western culture is the best culture. And it's the culture that people should be accessing and the culture that people should be educating themselves in. And what we want to argue is that this system of cultural imperialism by Western culture is extremely destructive. And it inhibits native people's abilities, it inhibits language speakers to fully express themselves. So, for example, on YouTube, since YouTube is so dominated by English speakers, if you go on YouTube and you watch any video and you scroll down to the comments, you will very, very soon find comments in extremely broken English. These are not people who are comfortable with the language. They're accessing these videos from outside. And oftentimes these comments are extremely praising or trying to involve themselves in this culture. But this is not the culture that's theirs. So we're proposing a world where the internet and where where education, where these, rather than being dominated by global languages, are accessible in native languages, in the languages of which people are most comfortable. So I also want to dive in here to how language is the most powerful weapon used by colonialists. Actually, before I go into that, I want to talk a little bit about Gandhi. So Gandhi, in his work, India is one of the second largest populations in the world, and they also had one of the largest systems of colonization imposed upon them with the Dutch East India Company and the English East India Company. And what eventually happened is, after imposing their language upon them, they imposed government, they imposed a judiciary system. And so then what Gandhi comes out to say, as the voice of the people, he argues that this Western system is not what they want. And he was supported, and this voice that he was projecting outwards, he was projecting it in the English language, but also in his local language, in the Hindi language. And this allowed his fellow Indians to listen to him, because the majority of Indians were accessing this in the Hindi language. And he argued that, like, the education, for example, Western education values advancement and values personal advancement. It values economic success. It values intellectual, just maximizing your intellect and learning as much as possible. But the idea of Western learning is extremely limited when compared against something like Indian learning. So the English system suppresses this very different, very Eastern method of educating oneself, which is educating one's body as well as the mind, educating their character, learning wisdom, coming to peace with oneself. And this is a system that inherently, through global languages, is diminished. And we regret this, and we believe that the growth of global language led to this very destructive system. And I also want to quickly address, to just give a little more factual basis to some of the arguments made earlier about the comfortable upper class and the lazy middle class. This is not just an idea that we're coming up with as the proponents, or not the promote, but as the proprietors of colonialism. this is something that's been recognized by the colonials themselves, and they've recognized as extremely destructive systems that lock people in their places. Proud to oppose. Proud to government. Thank you. I have to run.
No worries.
I have this.
I'm gonna let you up too. I'm just trying to stick it out so I can hear everybody, and then I'm gonna go grab dinner to go so I can tutor my peeps. Okay, sorry.
It's cool.
I'll say your name.
Hi, I'm Justin. All right. Judge, I would like first to begin my speech by touching on some rebuttal from the member of the government, and then I will bring in my extension into the debate that the rise of global languages actually benefit the global community that's currently in place and enhances global relations as a whole. So getting into the refutation of what has been presented in the debate so far, especially from the member of government. The member of government talked heavily about how global languages create the system, and so that this House regrets the rise of global languages because the global languages itself created the system. And what he fails to kind of recognize is the fact that the world is as it is today. That there are different languages that take place, and that they didn't necessarily give rise to the system. The system was already in place before, where countries had more power in the global community, such as America and the UK and Germany, and these languages were already predominant in these countries already. And he brings in the idea of as well of Gandhi, and how Gandhi represents how global languages were a net negative because he was able to use Hindi in his own country and spread the word to his local community. But his example actually turned his argument on himself, because the fact that he spoke not only in Hindi but in English too shows that he wasn't only reaching the community that was with him in India, but also to other global communities that saw what was going on with the British government committing atrocities towards the Indian people, and were able to kind of show their support for the Indian people, to the point that British reporters would come in from the UK and would come and interview Gandhi and show their support, and they would not have been reached if there weren't the global language use of English. And so another important component to take in that both gov teams have kind of failed to recognize is that the rise of a global language doesn't necessarily mean destruction of any other languages. It just means that there's going to be a common language spoken between many peoples in different countries so that they can connect them together. Just because you're introducing English into different countries in Africa doesn't eliminate those different languages they have in there. Separately, that might have happened in colonialism 100 or 200 years ago, but the fact of the matter is now the global language isn't forcing one language on another. It's a language that's used predominantly in the global community, and so many other different countries and communities learn that language as well so they can actively participate. So when the member of government talks about how that they need to push the world so that education is used in many different languages, and that technology should be given to many different languages. The fact of the matter is that this is not what the world is like. A lot of technology was developed in the U.S., and so therefore it was created in the U.S. primarily for the U.S., and most of technology is therefore in English. So the creators of that technology aren't, when they're developing these new innovative processes, thinking, oh, maybe we should translate this into 200 different languages so that anybody can access it. The rise of a global language such as English allows for everybody to come together and access that. And another point brought up a lot by opening government was about colonialism. And yes, and they brought up an example of the Spanish colonizing South America, and yes, this is true back in the 15 and the 1600s, when, yes, they forced Spanish onto these different colonies, but the fact of the matter is that that's different than the world we live in today, where, yes, there is still some neocolonialism, but it's more of a global community and globalization that's coming together. And so it's not forcing languages on each other, it's everybody learning those languages so that they can better work together. And so this leads me into my extension about global community being enhanced in global relations. The fact of the matter is that if in many different countries, everybody has one common language between them, whether that be English or German or Spanish or French. It allows for people of different communities, one, to be able to converse with each other in person, over the internet, and foster just kind of a greater global community that, as a whole, leads us to greater world peace together, less conflicts, better understanding of each other. And through this, you can see that, yes, there is going to be another language that's going to be spoken by this culture. They'll still maintain their own language, but they have to sacrifice slight cultural integrity to learn this other language. But the fact of the matter is that everybody understands that culture better. They're not eliminating that culture. Everybody in the global community can understand that culture better through the use of language. Yes.
Often when English moves into a country like this, it inherently is being placed with higher value over this said language, and people tend to prefer to choose to speak English because of these systems that have been put in place by colonial oppressors, and then they do lose out on the cultural benefits of their own language, and they don't attempt to understand because they're speaking English.
Well, to respond to that, one, there are countries where maybe they're speaking English a little bit more predominantly, but that doesn't mean that the whole other language that they were speaking ceases to exist. It doesn't mean that culture is wiped out. They're still using English, and they can still have their culture represented and spoken in another language. And another reason for this might also be that through this language, as Opening Up talked about, it allows them to bring them into greater global markets and to increase their economic benefits as well. Another thing that's important to talk about with these global communities, so take as Opening Up talked about with Chinese, and how it's now transforming into a global language as they invest into Africa, and how the Chinese market has become very increasingly important. You'll see a lot of American and European businessmen start to learn Chinese languages like Chinese, so that they can participate in these markets, so that everybody can gain from these benefits, and so that there's a greater global community as a whole, and everybody benefits as a whole as well. You can also see another example is that throughout Europe, a lot of different people in European countries speak English. And although that's not their only language, they speak their own home language as well. They speak English so that when American tourists come through, they're able to better experience that culture and understand that culture. And so the global community can therefore come together even more. And so through the rise of global languages, you can see a greater sense of a global community. And through this, you can see better economic benefits, a greater push towards world peace and less conflicts, and greater understanding of cultures as a whole. Thank you.
All right, there you go. Last speaker.
What? What? Okay.
Alright, my name is Danzong. This is like my very first debate of my life.
It's okay, you're gonna do
So,
great.
yeah.
Do you have a timer or anything?
No.
Here, okay.
Right, so
You gotta dance.
All right, I'll just start when you start talking. I'll start it.
cool. I don't know all the official stuff, so I guess I'm just gonna start.
Yeah, just start. It's okay.
Right.
Just start talking.
I am the government thing, and a key point in this debate has been that whether the rise of global languages limit people, or if they promote growth. I am here to rebut the other side, and the first point he makes is he rebuts our first speaker's argument by saying that the world was as it is, and the system exists before the English language is implemented. Well, I rebut this point by saying that this is the problem. By requiring that people know English or a global language like Chinese, which he said repeatedly, it requires learning another language to participate in the global market, and in the global market, especially when countries like Africa, where their economy depends on learning the Chinese language. This is harmful to the people who don't have the time and effort to learn a language as difficult as Chinese because the Chinese language still uses hieroglyphics, which requires the extensive memorization of new characters, and it would take at least a year or two to master the language in a conversational manner where it can be used for business and everyday lifestyle dialogue. But not everyone, especially those in Africa, can afford this time investment. Not even without the education, even if they can't find the proper education to propel themselves into a global market. A language like Chinese requires more time. So learning that language means that the person has to devote time in taking care of themselves while still learning the language, while being not a participant in the global market. And this is extremely hard for someone in poverty. Number two, he brings up that an introduction of global languages does not destroy the language. It just coexists with the normal language. Well, I rebut this by saying that it does harm the official language, as in that it does take away their culture, as in because when everyone speaks the language, when everyone speaks the language and global trade is happening at this pace, when global trade is happening right at your doorsteps, you have to be a part of it to get your earnings, salaries, and job, etc. Why this destroys our culture is because, take for example, a country like Mongolia, or any other country that has been colonized. When a country is colonized, the first thing the country that is colonizing does is destroy their culture, in which they do by changing their clothing, changing their lifestyle, changing their beliefs, maybe religion, and next they try to change their language. This is the case in which why English is so widespread today. This is because of colonization, and this is the reason why English is the global language now. If there were no colonization by the British, this may not have happened today. Also, I would like to bring up a point. The other speaker said that globalization will help us better work together between borders, between cultures. I say this is wrong because when a country in poverty tries to do business with a country as developed as the Chinese or the English, they're looking for ways to maximize the profit, meaning that they'll exploit cheap labor. They'll try to manipulate the other countries. So increased communication and increased trade between these countries might not necessarily mean a good thing. Yeah.
Don't you think, though, that through increased language between different countries, it wouldn't be necessarily exploiting them, but giving them that opportunity in the first place to be able to take part in different industries where they could create more of a future for themselves?
I would rebut that by saying that when these countries go in to trade with poor countries, their economy is so much better at developing the other things. Like, say a country develops their food by local farmers, but a country like America, which develops their agriculture, which is heavily mechanized, heavily dependent on capital, produces them at really cheap costs. So they just so they sell their products into the market of the country, which is called price dumping, which drives the local workers, farmers, and industries out of business, which in the long term makes them dependent on a country like America, which is almost like colonialism. And I would like to conclude this by stating that a world where everyone speaks the same language isn't isn't the best outcome, because it leads to everyone thinking the same way. Everyone thinking the same way would mean a loss of culture, a loss of innovation, because everyone has the same ideologies. No one is from a different background, meaning everyone will think the same way, will not think to improve themselves, or will not have specific...
You're out of time.
Okay.
But that was
Go.
good.
That
Hardly
was
anyone
really
filled
good.
up 7 minutes in their first
Yeah,
speech.
that was really good.
Here, here.
Good job.